Hi everyone. We're finally moving on to the first kingdom of species, plantae or plants. I personally love plants, and learning about their anatomical parts and life cycles is very fascinating. Because interestingly, they are kind of like humans. They have evolved from simpler species, for example. They have a mouth for breathing, a way to reproduce with sperm and eggs, etc. They are just simpler organisms, though, since they don't have a gazillion bones or a gazillion muscles for us to study like the human body. So this will be a very straightforward chapter. It might not be very short, kind of medium pace. We'll discuss more about, where plants come from according to evolution and introduce two groups of plants, one that is non-vascular and one that is vascular. So let's get started. For much of the Earth's history, land surface was largely lifeless with nothing in it. Maybe it wasn't until 3.2 billion years ago that some prokaryotes started to appear. And it wasn't until 500 million years ago that small plants, fungi, and animals appeared on Earth. And then the first forests were seen to have appeared 385 million years ago. So here's a quick overview of what we will be talking about in these two chapters on plant diversity. Plants originated from green algae about 470 million years ago. That's where plants come from, algae. And by 425 million years ago, some early plants had traits that was able to facilitate their life on land, just like and we'll talk about those details of how they become adapted to life on land in a bit. And now, these traits will include reproductive structures, photosynthetic branches, and the structures that anchor the plants to the soil, which are these three things right here depicted in the picture. Over time, early plants give rise to rich diversity of plants that we see today, including non-vascular plants, seedless, and in the category of non-vascular plants, we have mosses, um, your liverworts, hornworts, etc. And then there is another category of seedless vascular plants, such as ferns. And then lastly, you have your seed plants, such as cone-bearing plants and flowering plants. We will be discussing the first two types, non-vascular and seedless vascular plants, in this particular chapter. And then we'll move on to seed plants in chapter 27. Today, there are more than 325,000 known plant species. And this is very important that we have this many species for all the genetic variations they exhibit and ensure that enough of them inhabit the land. Without plants, life on Earth will not be possible. And on top of that, we talked about biodiversity, the importance of that in the last chapter. So having lots of plant varieties is part of having that biodiversity. Now, because plants have enabled other life forms to survive on land, that's why they're so important. First of all, plants supply oxygen, okay? They are also a key source of food for terrestrial animals. And plants such as trees that make up a forest physically create habitats required by animals and many other organisms to survive in. So without plants, species will lose their home, which will reduce their population size and reproduction rates. Species will lose their food source, and we will not have enough oxygen to survive. Hence, it is essential for our planet to have an abundant variety of plants. Before jumping into the specific type of plants, we will first discuss their evolutionary development. According to the phylogenetic tree of plants, which we will look at in the next few slides, the closest relatives of plants is a type of freshwater green algae called chirophytes. Here are some evidence that plants have algae ancestry. First, plants and some species of algae share many key traits. They are multicellular eukaryotes. They are photosynthetic autotrophs. If you remember from last semester, 1406, we talked about autotrophs, photoautotroph, etc. It means that they are organisms that can produce their own food using light. Third, they have chloroplasts with chlorophyll A and B. Lastly, they have cell walls made of cellulose. Whether it be algae or plant, they have four of these key traits together. But we must keep in mind that algae are not plants because algae are actually photosynthetic protists. So it's got, according to the five classification kingdom we talked about in the last chapter, protist is a completely different kingdom compared to plantae. As I've mentioned before, a group of green algae called chirophytes are the only present-day algae that share distinctive traits with plants. First of all, they have cells, okay? These are more specific traits we're talking about other than the key traits we mentioned earlier. So chirophytes actually have cells that have these circular rings of proteins embedded in the plasma membrane. And these circular rings function to synthesize cellulose for construction of cell walls. Again, this is something we learned from 1406 last semester, that our plant cell wall are made up of macromolecules called cellulose. So here's an image of that protein ring. And this image is actually taken with a TEM, which is actually standing for transmission electron microscope. It is the microscope that is able to provide the highest resolution of tiny structures. We're talking about at the nanometer level. As you can see at this scale here, we're talking, this is 20 nanometers. Something that light microscopes from our lab bench can never do or can never resolve at. It is the same type of microscope that is used to view viruses when we're talking about TEM. So I thought it looked pretty cool. Kind of looked like a mochi donut. So if you remember mochi donut, cellulose, mixed cellulose. So in species of plants that have sperm cells that with a flagella, the structure of those sperm cells also closely resembles sperm cells from chirophytes. So, and just as we have talked about morphological homologies, we can't forget about the molecular homologies, where analysis of nuclear DNA, chloroplast DNA, and mitochondrial DNA all have supported close relationship between plants and chirophytes. And actually, a recent analysis of about 900 protein coding genes in the nucleus found that Zinigma, which is a filamentous pond algae, it's a chirophyte that is actually the most closely related to plants. And they're actually the closest living relatives of plants. They are still alive today. And this is actually how they look like under the microscope. Even though they are the closest relative of plants, it is important to note that it does not mean plants have descended from these living algae, because, but it does provide us with clues regarding, which is, the correct algae ancestor of plants. That is actually still a mystery till this day. Many species of chirophyte algae usually inhabit shallow waters around the edges of ponds and lakes, where there can be actually occasional drying. So to overcome and allow for chirophyte species to survive, natural selection has favored chirophyte zygote that has a durable polymer called the sporopollenin, which actually serve to prevent those zygotes from drying out, because there is occasional drying wherever they're inhabiting. Plant spores are also encased by a tough sporopollenin walls. So that's another thing they share between algae and plants. So this is a similar chemical adaptation that is also found in plant spores. As natural selection continues, accumulation of traits will allow first plants to live permanently on land, which offer enormous benefits. Okay, we'll talk about all of these different adaptations that plants have to overcome, or algae have to overcome, and become our plants that live on land. First, bright sunlight can be unfiltered by water if the plants were to live on land. And there's also plankton, which are marine organism that drifts in the water that can block out some of the sunlight. So without water and plankton, plants can have all the bright sunlight they need for photosynthesis. Second, the atmosphere on Earth offer a lot more CO2 or carbon dioxide than water do. Third, The soil by the water's edge are actually rich in mineral nutrients that you can't get in, when plants or algae live in water. But there are some land challenges that plants have to overcome in order to thrive abundantly on land. If we compare living partially in water versus completely on land, there will be some sort of relative water scarcity, because you're talking about living next, partially like your feet sticking into the water versus completely on dry land. So there's got to be some relative water scarcity. In addition, algae is surrounded by water that gives it support, but on land, there will be no support against the pull of gravity. So you can see that if you imagine, let's say you take a bunch of seaweed that looks as if they're floating very nicely with their leaves spread out in the water, waving around. But as soon as they're, washed ashore on land, or you picked it up and take it up on the land, they're just floppy and flat against the ground due to not having proper structural supports. So plants will have to overcome these challenges as they inhabit the land. And we'll talk about what they do to overcome these challenges. Here is the phylogenetic tree from the ancestral algae, right here, to plants, right here. And plants are also called embryophytes, and we'll explain why that is in a bit. For now, just know that it means plants have embryos in them. And it is with this phylogenetic tree diagram that we can see embryophytes, or plants, are closest relatives or sister taxa, as we've learned from the last chapter, with chirophytes. So it is the closest relative in terms of evolution, of course. Now, before chirophytes, you have chlorophytes as well here, and red algae, and they all shared a common early algae ancestor right here. Hence, as plants diversified, new adaptations enabled their living on land, and we'll talk about each of these next. From the first plants onwards, several adaptations help facilitate their survival and reproduction on dry land. Because remember, we said that in order for natural selection to occur, we have to have, or evolution, we have to have survival of the particular plants and traits, and then those plants or organisms have to be able to reproduce. So now we're going to talk about adaptation to help them survive and reproduce on dry land. These traits that I'm going to talk about next in these few slides are traits that are not found in chirophytes, because that's where that common ancestor have diverged from chirophytes onto plants. So that's why these are special traits that only plants have, not chirophytes. First of those adaptations is called the alternation of generations, which are life cycle of all plants that alternate between two generations of distinct multicellular organisms. One generation is called gametophytes, another generation is called sporophytes. Gametophytes, or if we were to define it directly, means gametes producing plants. There are multicellular haploids that generate gametes by mitosis. So don't mistake this from what we've learned about human cells or animal cells in general. Before, when we talked about meiosis, that's how we produce gametes. But now we're talking about plants. So in this particular case, gametophytes are actually haploids to begin with, and they just have to generate gametes by mitosis. There's no need for meiosis here because they were haploids to begin with. The whole point of meiosis was to halve the amount of chromosomes, but here they are multicellular haploids to begin with. So they just use mitosis to generate more gametes, and then of course those gametes can fuse together to cause fertilization and will form your diploid zygotes, as with the normal fertilization process. Sporophytes, on the other hand, are defined as spore-producing plants, and they are multicellular diploids that are formed by mitotic division of the zygotes, because we ended with zygote here. So this zygote will then undergo mitosis to form sporophytes. So then the mature sporophyte will then produce the haploid spores by meiosis, because now we are going back from diploids back to haploids. So both gametophytes and spores are haploids. That's why there is these two generation of distinct multicellular organisms. It's because they have these two different haploids. One is a gamete, one is what we call spores. And for plants, they can't walk around. So we'll talk about why they need these alternation of generation in a bit. And spores will actually develop into a new haploid organism. Again, that is something different from what we see in humans or animals. And then mitotic division of the spores will produce new multicellular gametophytes. And then we do it all over again back to gametophytes. This is how we get gametophytes that are haploid. It's from spores that have developed into the new organism. Now you can see those 5 steps in the pictures here, in this picture here. Again, first you have gametophytes right here that produces these haploid gametes, which is why it's signified by a little n, which means it only has one set of chromosome as haploids. Second, 2 of these gametes will fuse together, 1 gamete, 2 gamete, fuse together to give you fertilization and form a diploid zygote. This is why you have 2n here, signifying diploid. And then third, zygote will develop into a multicellular diploid sporophytes, okay, also diploid. Fourth, the sporophyte will produce unicellular haploid spores by meiosis. And fifth, those spores will then develop into multicellular haploid gametophytes, okay, that will repeat the cycle all over again. And they just have to do it through mitosis. All right, so this alternation of generation allows for plants to do both sexual and asexual reproduction. Haploid spores actually can disperse over large distances without the need for water. Again, giving this as an advantage of why is an adaptation for plants to live on land. And that's why you need this alternation of generation, okay? Because like I said, plants can't walk around and start spreading their gametes everywhere, okay? And if we're talking about the sexual reproduction, they have to be close together, and we'll talk about why that's the case. Hence, this is why they need spores. Spores will allow those, those little, in a sense, pre-plant to be kind of dispersed around everywhere, and they can go longer distance and allow the population to thrive. Second, so other than you have alternation of generation, second adaptation that allows for plants to live on land is that plants have what's called multicellular dependent embryos. It's kind of like, before I get to that, multicellular plant embryos actually develop from zygotes are retained within tissues of the female parent, which is that one of those gametophytes. And we'll distinctly talk about what is male gametophyte versus female gametophyte and what are those called. But it's kind of like how human embryos are nested into female's uterine wall in order for them to develop, be nourished, and remain protected. And this is the same concept, okay? Similar case where these embryos that are plant embryos are just protected within tissues of the female parent or gametophyte. So this is again where I said some concepts from plants are kind of similar to humans. So parental tissues protect from the gametophyte, female gametophyte will protect the developing embryo from harsh environments, cold, rain, snow, whatever it is, and provide nutrients such as sugars and amino acids. You can kind of see that in this picture right here, where the embryo, which is this center thing right here, is surrounded by all of these maternal tissues, and then it's kind of nicely nuzzled in there. And the plant embryo actually has specialized cells called placental transfer cells, which enhances the transfer of nutrients to embryos through ingrowth of wall surface. This is why plants are known as embryophytes. So you can kind of see it here in this TEM magnified view of the embryo, because we're trying to look in there and magnify it up to see whether there is ingrowth that we said so they're supposed to be there in the wall surface. So supposedly here, you see these little squiggly lines. Those squiggly lines represent the wall ingrowth, and they are actually surrounded by this blue line layer of placental transfer cells indicated by that blue line. So that's why you have all of these cells that help and make sure nutrients are being transferred from the maternal or female parent gametophyte into the embryos itself, which again is very similar to human embryos, where a specialized type of cells we eventually form the umbilical cord and the placenta, eventually where they will feed nutrients to the baby from the mom. So if you will be taking AMP2, we will talk about that whole process in humans. But this is why plants are known as embryophytes. Third, plants have walled spores that are produced in what's called the sporangia. The sporophyte stage of plants' life cycle has multicellular organs called the sporangia. Okay, so that's what is sporangia? Well, they are those that produce spores, or organs that produce spores, and they also protect them until they mature and are released into the environment. So again, you can see in this image here where the purple clumps within are the spores housed within the sporangium. And just like how eggs are housed within ovaries for humans until the egg matures and then bursts out of the ovaries, it is similar here. These spores are housed within the sporangium until they mature, and then the sporangium will release the spores in their own different way, depending on what type of plants it is. So the spores are also protected with sporopollenin that makes their walls resistant to harsh environments, allow them to survive while they're being dispersed into the air, go following the wind to elsewhere. And that's what allows them to sort of go to a new location and colonize that new land that this plant has never been before. So living on land no longer allows for easy access to water. So now, the plants are really relying on the wind for dispersal of their offspring and colonize new lands. And so the fourth adaptation for land that plants have are what's called apical meristems. These are localized regions of cell division that are usually at the tips of roots and also of shoots. Roots go downwards into the soil, shoots go upwards into the sky, where we can have stems shooting out and also leaves coming out. So they can divide throughout the plant's entire life, these apical meristems. This is what enables the roots and shoots to elongate, going down into the soil and also up into the air as tall as it can. And this is how it increases the plant's exposure to environmental resources. The more branch roots a plant have, the more it can absorb, because there's more surface area that these roots are having. More branching means more surface area, more nutrients you can absorb. Same thing for stems and leaves. The more stems and branching you have, the more leaves you're going to have. The more leaves you're going to have, more photosynthesis, and that's great for the plants. So you can see in this picture here that shows you the apical meristem of a shoot where leaves are actually developing. And here is a apical meristem of a root. Okay, so this is coming from the shoot, this is coming from the roots, and we can both see the apical meristem cells right here that are dividing and dividing to elongate either the shoot or the root. It's kind of like how our bones grow for us to become taller. Plants also have a way to elongate themselves as well. The fifth adaptation that plants have for land is called a cuticle, which is not like cuticle in our fingers, but it's a layer that covers the epidermis, which is defined as the outermost cellular layer of plants, kind of like our skin. We have epidermis on our skin because it is the outermost surface layer. Same thing for plants, they have an epidermis as well. And cuticle covers over that layer, and cuticles are actually made up of wax and other polymers. So it's kind of like an extra protection layer before you get to delicate tissues and cells underneath. Then the functions it does is that it helps prevent excessive water loss from above ground plants, from any above ground plant organs. So again, like we're saying, the algae used to live in water. Now that we're trying to adapt it for plants to thrive on land, we have to have some way to prevent this water loss and contain the water inside the plant. Second thing is that cuticle can protect against some microbial attack. Not all, because some plants still die from microorganisms, infection, and diseases. But it protects against some micro organism attack, just like how skin serves as our first defense of our immune systems, kind of like that. Sixth adaptation for land is that plants have what's called stomata. So stomata are openings that allow for exchange of gases and that facilitates photosynthesis, because what plants do is they take in carbon dioxide and then they release oxygen for us humans to breathe in. So there's got to be openings for those gases to be exchanged, and they can also maintain water balance. So you may have remember the stomata from Bio 1406 when we talked about photosynthesis, and they kind of look like this little mouth at the bottom. Some leaves are on the surface, but most of them are on the bottom. They allow for CO2, carbon dioxide, to go into the leaves for photosynthesis to occur, and the carbon cycle and everything. And then oxygen can leave plant cells to give us humans oxygen to breathe in. Second is that water can evaporate from the plants in a process called transpiration to release any excess water that the plant don't need. Sometimes when I water my house plants, I might overwater it, and the next thing you know, I see little droplets of water at the ends of the leaves. So though that's transpiration, it's a way for the plant to say, hey, I'm having too much water. Instead of dying and from too much osmosis going on, I can transpire it out and still keep that osmotic pressure within the cells stabilized. Third, when these stomata can actually close to minimize water loss under very hot and dry condition. So when it's hot, they're not like humans, they cannot sweat. So they actually close up their stomata so that all that important water inside the cells won't be lost to the environment, because in a hot, dry condition, the soil probably don't have that much water either. All right, so they literally, like I said, kind of look like mouths on the leaf, and this is actually a SEM image, which is a scanning electron microscopy that allows for us to visualize the tiny stomata on surfaces of plants. This is an open one right here, and this is a closed one right here. Pretty cool, right? And we actually have SEM at our campus at Dallas College, at Richland campus, and a research group actually did take images of stomata from leaves they have looked at, which was pretty cool. All right, in wrapping up the topic of how plants have evolved from algae, scientists have discovered some of the first signs of early plants on land, where microscopic fossils of spores started to appear around 470 million years ago. Well, you might say, well, how can you tell that the fossilized spores that was found somewhere on Earth was actually from a plant and not from an algae or a fungi for that matter? So here are some of the ways scientists can tell. First, chemical composition of fossilized plant spores actually match those that we have today. Okay, so they actually can get chemical composition from these fossilized spores right here, and they match it with the plant spores we have today, and they match up. Second, walls of ancient spores have structural features that are only found in spores of certain plants, which means that they have to be plant spores. Third, similar to Similar spores were found embedded in plant cuticle material that resembles spore-bearing tissue in living plants. So again, not only are the spores looking the same, their chemical composition are the same, they are actually found embedded in plant-like things that resemble what we have today in living plants. So, and fossils of larger plant structures called the Cooksunia right here, it's actually a sporangium. It was found about 425 million years ago, which is about 45 million years after the appearance of fossilized plant spores. Again, it makes sense. First, we have these fossilized little plant spores around, and then we have sporangium that was discovered or evolved later to have many, many spores and allows it to disperse into the wind, like we were talking about earlier. Now, unfortunately, again, which follows, where all these years we're talking about here follows the timeline of going from simple spores to a larger part of the plant that can house more spores in a complex organism. Unfortunately, the precise age and form of the first plants have yet to be discovered. We don't know what that species looked like or when it appeared, but those ancestral species gave rise to vast diversity of plants we have today. That we know for sure, but we just don't know who they are yet. Since the time early plants have inhabited the land, some have actually become extinct, and currently we have just about 10 phyla of plants that are still living. What is phyla? If you forgot, it was from the last chapter when we talked about the lineage system of classification, where we talked about kingdom, domain, kingdom, etc. And there was a classification called phylum. So there's actually 10 phylum of these plants that are still living today. Here's the table that gives you those 10 phylum. We'll be talking more about them in this chapter and the next. Here is the phylogenetic tree of those phyla that we will be studying about, and this is actually a phylogenetic tree that is where the branch length is proportional to time. So you can tell how long ago that angiosperms gymnosperms started to diverge, and then the year that liverworts, mosses, and hornworts started to diverge, etc. You can actually tell that from this particular phylogenetic tree diagram. The way the textbook have broken these plants down is by a few main traits. First of those being whether or not the plants have an extensive system of vascular tissue, which are actually cells that are joined in tubes for transport of water and nutrients throughout the entire plant body. Kind of like our blood vessels. That's why they're called vascular plants. So most present-day plants have a complex vascular tissue system. About 93% of all living plant species have this. So that's why they're called vascular plants, which are subdivided into lycophytes and monilophytes. Lycophytes include club mosses and their relatives. Monilophytes are fern and their relatives. We'll talk more about them at the end of the chapter, close to the end of the chapter. And because these two groups don't have seeds in their plants, they are also called seedless vascular plants, okay? Seedless vascular plants. Plants that don't have an extensive transport system, we call them non-vascular plants, okay? And then these non-vascular plants are also called bryophytes, which includes liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. Third, we can look at whether a plant has seeds or not, which I briefly mentioned just now. A seed is defined as an embryo packaged with a supply of nutrients inside some sort of protective coat. And seed plants can be subdivided into gymnosperm, which are where the seeds are actually not enclosed in chambers. They say gymnosperms kind of like defined as naked, doesn't have anything enclosing around it, whereas angiosperm, angiosperm are flowering plants where their seeds develop inside chambers that originate within flowers. So, like I said, angiosperms are flowering plants, and nearly 90% of all living plant species today are angiosperms. We will discuss each of these plants throughout chapter 26 and also chapter 27 as our survey of plant diversity. Excuse me, not chapter 26, 27, is chapter 29 and chapter 30. I don't know what I was thinking. But chapter 29, which is now plant diversity 1, and chapter 30, which is plant diversity 2. All right, so let's start by talking about non-vascular plants, or the bryophytes. They are represented by 3 phyla, which is phylum Heptophyta, which is the common name for is liverworts. The second one is phylum Bryophyta, which common name for them are mosses. And then thirdly, you have phylum Anthocerophyta, which common name for them are hornworts. And you can see from this phylogenetic tree right here that they are the plant lineage that diverge earliest in the history of plant evolution. Here's your ancestral green algae. So this is the very first splits of liverworts and then into mosses and your hornworts. So they are the earliest plant lineage. We start from there, okay? All right, so in all 3 bryophytes, haploid gametophytes are dominant stage of life cycles because we talked about how plants have alternation of generation. And we didn't say whether they're more so gametophyte or sporophytes, okay? But now we're saying for bryophytes, most of their life cycle is residing within the gametophytes. And this is actually contrary to vascular plants, where sporophyte generation for vascular plants is either equal to or even larger and more complex than gametophyte generations. We'll talk about that when we get to the vascular plants. So gametophytes are usually, gametophytes of the bryophytes are usually larger and longer living than sporophytes. And when their spores are dispersed to a favorable habitat, which usually, we're talking about moist soil or well, on the tree bark, they will germinate to grow into gametophytes. You can see here in this picture that this portion of the plant are sporophytes, which is why you see sporophyte right there. And then all of these portion of the plants are gametophytes. Sporophytes are very tiny. There are kind of dots laying at the top. And then you have this big carpet of green down here. Those are the gametophytes. For moss spores, they germinate into what's called the protonema. Okay, protonema are defined as masses of green, branch, and also only one cell thick filaments, which is what you see in this picture here. And they will give rise to large surface area that enhance water and mineral absorption. So protonema produces one or more buds. Okay, that's how you start from germination. And these buds will then develop into a moss gametophyte, which are usually ground-hugging carpets, which is why you saw in this picture, it literally looks like a green ground-hugging carpet. And we usually see moss like this in our daily lives. And in this particular image here, we see the protonema branching filaments all over the place, and they're green color. And then these right here are actually the buds. Again, remember to recognize these pictures because for sure, identifications of these different plant images will be on the exam. So remember to recognize and identify identify them, be able to identify them. Now, bryophyte gametophytes will not become tall plants. They can never do that because their body parts are just too thin. We just said they start from protonema, and these protonema are only one cell thick filaments, not very thick things. They're too thin, and then second, they also have no vascular tissue that enables them for long distance transport. That's an important thing. I mean, imagine your human body without blood vessels. And we just rely everything on diffusion. Well, we're not going to get oxygen to every part of our body quick enough. This is why we have vascular tissue inside our human body. Same thing for plants. If they don't have any vascular tissue and they're thin, They cannot be tall or long. They have to be very small, short, for that matter. So, but them being thin actually gives them an advantage because even when we're talking about, oh, they're short, no, it's not very good, but is that they actually give them some sort of advantage. And that advantage is that because they're so thin, things can be easily diffusing through them and distributing through them, and we can actually transport materials without needing any specialized vascular tissue in these particular bryophytes. Though some mosses did adapt to having conducting tissues in the center of their stems, so they can grow as tall as 2 feet, but still only 2 feet, but because they are conducting tissues, not necessarily vasculature that we have in vascular plants. And they say that these conducting tissues should have arose independently from vascular plants by convergent evolution. If you forgot what convergent evolution was, it is something we talked about from the last chapter, saying that two traits are analogous because they are similar not because of shared ancestry, but because of similar pressure in their environment that they have developed and selected for similar traits. So in this case, they're saying that because bryophytes are so different from vascular plants that they couldn't have been in sharing the same trait due to being a close relative of each other. So they say that these vasculature or conducting tissues in some mosses probably have just arose independently through convergent evolution. So bryophytes, gametophytes, usually don't have roots. These are not a characteristic of non-vascular plants. Instead, they have something called rhizoids. Okay, rhizoids are usually long, tubular single cells or filaments, and they are for the sole purpose of anchoring the plant to the ground. Rhizoids don't play any role whatsoever in water or mineral absorption. They are not your roots. Okay, roots do that in vascular plants, but rhizoids in non-vascular plants kind of look like this. They are just for anchoring purposes. Make sure the plant doesn't, float away or go, or can't, starts go diffusing everywhere. They are tied to one place. So roots can do water mineral absorption. Rhizoids, they cannot. And bryophytes, gametophytes, can form multiple what's called gametangia. Okay, gametangia are multicellular structures that produce gametes and covered by protective tissue of some sorts. So female gametangia are called archegonia, okay, archegonia, which actually produces only one egg at a time. And then male gametangia are called antheridia, which produces many sperm. And if we think about this, this also is kind of similar to humans, where females ovulate one egg each time per month. And then, whereas for males, they can have many sperm at the same time. So that's kind of similar with humans as well when we're talking about female and male gametangia in these non-vascular plants. And flagellated sperm can swim through the film of water and enter the archegonia to fertilize the egg. Again, very similar process as humans. And then once the sperm fertilizes the egg inside the archegonia, the embryo will actually remain in the archegonia, and then they will actually allow for placental transfer cells to transport all the nutrients that the embryo will need until they mature to become a sporophyte. Okay, and here are light microscope images of the antheridia, okay, antheridia and archegonia. Antheridia inside, you see sperm cells within those enclosed compartments, while archegonia have these little kind of clear looking circles where there are your egg cells within. Because fertilization requires sperms to swim through a thin film of water, bryophytes are usually found in moist habitats, as I have talked about previously. And it also means that sexual reproduction, where there are separate male and female species, will be more successful if the plants are closer to each other. They have to be in by distance, be close to each other. You can't, the longer the sperm have to swim, the more likely they will die before they will be able to get to the archegonia or other means of separating from the film of water. So this is why they need to be distant, physically close to each other. On the contrary, actually, many bryophytes species can increase its population through asexual reproduction. It doesn't have to do sexual reproduction. You can do asexual reproduction. For example, some mosses actually form what's called brood bodies, kind of looks like this, and they're really like kind of like small plantlets, that's what they call it, and they would detach from the parent plants and grow into new identical copies of the plants. Okay, again, this is something we can do. It's not like we can rip off our arm and that arm will eventually become another human being. But that's kind of like what we're saying here with the plants. They can actually peel off these little small brood bodies from the parental plants, and then those brood bodies will eventually become a whole new plant from that in and of itself. Okay, so you can see in this picture here how a brood body kind of look like, and there are multiple of them coming out of the parent plant. So bryophytes, sporophytes, can actually contain green plastids that are photosynthetic when they're young, which is why when they're young, they look green like this. But still, even though they're able to do photosynthesis, they cannot live independently. A sporophyte must remain attached to the parental gametophyte throughout its whole entire lifetime. They have to rely on the parent gametophyte in order for them to get any nutrient and water. If they detach from there, they will die. So a typical sporophyte will contain or consist of a foot right here, which is the sole job of foot is to absorb nutrient from the gametophyte itself. Okay, because this portion is the gametophyte, this portion is a sporophyte. This is an example, like a moss example. And so that foot kind of attaches and forms that connection with the gametophyte, I guess kind of like the umbilical cord going towards the placenta for the baby, human baby. We have a foot connecting with the gametophyte to absorb nutrients. And then you have a seta, which is a stalk for conducting those materials into the sporangium, which is up here. And another name for sporangium is actually called a capsule. And each capsule can produce spores by meiosis. And interestingly, one single capsule can produce over 5 million spores. This goes back to our concept from the very first chapter, in chapter 22, where we talked about, species tend to overproduce offspring in order for them to survive in the environment, because that allows for some of them to die, be able to die off. But still, even if some of them die off from the environment, you still have a good population size for the species to survive. So this goes with that. So the upper part of the capsule, this part gets interesting. Okay, so upper part of the capsule, which is this little pointy thing right here and this little teethy thing right here, actually has a ring of interlocking tooth-like structure called a peristome. And these peristome would actually open under dry condition, and then they would close when it's moist. And this allows moss spores to be discharged gradually instead of in a big cloud of spores. You have sometimes these peristome opening, and then you have these spores going out, and then they would close and then wait for the next time it opens, and then it will release a bunch of spores. So this, in a sense, allows them to somehow maybe be able to catch the wind, and the wind can help them disperse to longer distances, which I thought was pretty cool. that they just know when to open and close like that to dispense spores a little at a time. That they may be one, that maybe one bunch can catch a ride with the wind, and then they would carry them off to much longer distances and start a whole new bryophyte plant colonization there. And they do say these are plants that are usually inhabiting everywhere. They have an easy time to colonize a new area. Okay. So that was pretty cool. So this is really what it's depicting right here in this picture. They say that there's this end right there, that's the peristome, and there's a lid that covers over it, and then it will actually pop off when it matures, which allows for the disperse of the spores, given those teeth are opening, and then those teeth will close it up, stop the spores, and then it will open up again and allow the spores to come out. So with all that we have talked about regarding bryophytes, let's review everything using the moss's life cycle. First, spores develop into protonema, okay, or protonemata, which is the plural form of protonema, kind of like stomata with stoma. So then the second step, these haploid protonema will produce buds that divide by mitosis, and then they will eventually grow into gametophytes, whether it be a male gametophyte or a female gametophyte. They're both haploid still at this point. Then sperm will be generated from these male gametophytes called antheridia, and then they will be able to swim with their little flagella through a film of water to reach the egg, and the egg resides in the archegonia inside the female gametophyte. This process of sperm reaching the egg is called fertilization, happens within the archegonium, and then the embryo is formed or a zygote is formed first when the sperm fuses with the egg, which will eventually develop into their sporophyte embryo. Again, goes back to why plants are called embryophytes. And this also happens with the archegonium. Fifth, the sporophyte grows to a long stalk. Okay, right here, the long stalk. And that's usually called the seta. And then that seta emerges from the archegonium. And sixth, you have sporophyte remaining within the archegonium, and they're nutritionally dependent on the gametophyte as it remains attached by its foot. So here's its foot attached to the gametophyte itself, and then it keeps feeding nutrients from the gametophyte into the foot, into the seta, and into the capsule, so that, which is also called sporangium, insides, and feed all those little spores that are waiting to be dispersed. And seventh step is where meiosis occurs. Haploid spores develop within the capsule. The lid will actually pop off, like I was saying, and then they will mature. And the spores will release gradually depending on how humid it is or how dry it is. That peristome will open and close for that spore dispersal gradually. All right, so this is the moss life cycle. Let's watch a quick video of the animation part of it.
Let's see how the moss life cycle fits the alternation of generations pattern. Which letter indicates a gametophyte?
Which one?
Meiosis always produces haploid cells. In plants, these cells are spores, which develop into gametophytes.
Which one do you think it is?
Therefore, these plants are the moss gametophytes. And these are the moss sporophytes. In contrast to ferns, the moss sporophyte is not an independent plant. It remains attached to and dependent upon the gametophyte. In mosses, the gametophyte is the larger, longer-lived generation. Also notice that sperm cells from a male plant swim to reach an egg on a female plant.
Okay, so it is about 54 minutes or so. Let's stop. This is a good spot, I think, to start part 1, and then we'll continue from part 2.